Hello everyone, today we talk about the Iberian world and the Reconquista between the 8th and the 12th century, more specifically about the general, say, political development, the various conquests, and the military organization of both the Christian and the Muslim powers. Very generally, as you understand. I made several videos about the Reconquista, mostly every time we talk about Iberian, at least medieval Iberian history, of course, it was encompassed. Also, so it was always about the Reconquista, I think. In any case, that's an enormous chapter that should be analyzed very carefully, more in depth every time, because we were talking about different phases, different eras, even within the same phenomenon that literally molded also modern Iberian identity in a way that is truly unique compared to any other country. I mean, you could think, of course, every country has its own unique ways, but in speaking especially of medieval warfare, really the Iberian world is a world on its own. Not that it was disconnected from the rest, but it maintained some specificities and some dynamics that basically have brought also historiographically to define the period as, in fact, or the country better, probably a country organized for war, right? This reflected itself importantly also in early medieval warfare and probably the segmentation mostly of the Castilian, so the largest power, military, at the end of the period. There are various Reconquistas, of course, and there are different polities, most of which actually come into existence throughout the same Reconquista that eventually accomplish autonomously their work of reconquest. There is also an important foreign interference, because if we look at the broader Frankish world and how this influenced the Iberian North and the Christian revival, and in many ways, like militarily, but also ideologically, the Visigothic kingdom had an important cultural legacy that at a point, however, had to mediate with the influence of the papacy and the direction of what is effectively a crusade. We think the crusades were born just with 1095, and actually they had been going on already for a while in the previous centuries, especially in fact in the Western Mediterranean. And as we have also observed, another bit is about Iberian warfare. There is a dramatic military development and quite precocious also technological advancement in the Iberian Peninsula for multiple reasons, not just the influence of advanced military cultures as far as the Middle East that the Muslims brought with significant archaeological evidence, in fact among the Islamic, but also the same Christian panoplies, right? And later on, of course, the Christian influence as well. But in fact, a sort of let's say, in fact, warfare designed for the specifics of this European region. That again is quite peculiar on its own, and today we look at a bit more carefully, always considering we will have to discuss it much further and much more in detail. So as we were just saying, when we look at Iberian history, even in the first centuries of the Reconquista, we talk about the 8th, the 9th, well, we are really looking at a community organized for war, right? The struggle against the Muslims, the war of reconquest, and the religious struggles at the same time modeled the local communities in ways that we have also already described, not being so dichotomically oppositive like Christians versus Muslims. El Cid Campeador, the greatest Christian champion of the Reconquista and the symbol of the same, in many ways fought for the Muslims on several occasions. that specific context is, of course, a hybrid, right? One could say, well, yeah, of course, this is normal kind of in a frontier area, and warfare does always hybridize cultures and civilizations. But when we look at the Iberian Peninsula, this is a point that we have made in the videos about the Islamic conquests. We are looking at the Iberian Peninsula, right? As we are looking at, I don't know, Tunisia or Egypt or Mesopotamia or Anatolia. I mean, all those powers that we consider as, in fact, Arab, or even Moorish in this case, at the end of the day, were not just populated by very consistent amounts of Christians that still remained there, and also fighting, in fact, for the Muslims, as there were Muslims that fought for the Christians. I made a video about the Mudayyar. We talked about it extensively also in a recent video about I made about the Kingdom of Valencia, etc. But we're looking at probably a region that is practically the same. Like it's a pre-existing reality. Also military-wise, when you look at the fighting a la Jineta or other, specific characters of the Reconquista warfare, we're looking at, think about the Cantabrians, think about the Celtiberians against the Romans. I mean, those were lands that had, in a way, always lived in part like that. Even Visigothic times, the enormous frontier with the north was always there, right? There are very specific regions with the Ebro Valley, with it, and the south. Of course, the south was the most developed, and that afforded the Muslims, made the Muslims afford, say, better, properly a centralized state with a professional military, and in fact a permanent army. That was a big deal for the time. Just the Byzantines, in fact, the Caliphate had it, right? The Latin Germanic structures were would be more effective in the long run, but they took, in fact, a while before they catalyzed an important revival overall. And there are, in fact, many reasons why the Caliphate of Cordoba was eventually undermined and crippled to the point it could not really respond. It collapsed into the Taifas, and the Christians began their counter-offensive, right? There is properly a civilizational a dimension to this dynamic that cannot be, you cannot make too much relativism on, and especially in this case because it's also militarily traceable, right? When an advance is exhausted, the other side passes to counter-attack, right? That's the normal strategic reciprocal dichotomy, and it doesn't find any exception in the strategic realm, right? And there was surely much to conquer, especially for the rougher, more primitive polities of the Christian North in taking over the very rich and developed South. And yes, objectively, Muslim Spain was more advanced, and there are some people also say, well, because they don't like Islam in general, they have to twist history a little bit by saying, no, it was actually bad to live there. Well, it was pretty much bad to live everywhere in those times, and no, living in the Al-Andalus, even as a Christian, in Islamic times was not that bad, right? It was worse to live in the far north by many degrees. But this still triggered, of course, those moral forces that were necessary to start the Reconquest. And from the Muslim side, as we know, we also made a video about the Almoravids and the Almohads. There was this further reinjection essentially from North Africa, where most of the forces also that had taken over the Visigothic kingdom initially came from, rather than the Arabs, again, because were mostly Arabicized elite, right? And then, yes, of course, from the Atlas, from other areas of Northwest Africa, there were lots of troops, of colonists, simply at different waves, also because they were rougher and more tribal and primitive compared to Al-Andalus came to take over. So it's a bit like you can interpret these dynamics in very interesting ways, but that's not what we're discussing today in the first place. We're looking as I was saying before, first of all at the setting. So in 711, some events brought in a few years the Islamic tide not just up to the Pyrenees but also beyond, up to Septimania, right, Gothia, and even there beyond, as you know, never thoroughly studied the campaign or the Battle of Poitiers, but we will come to that at some point. In any case, we recently discussed Occitania, and we observed some interesting dynamics that were ongoing, so with the Caliphate of Al-Andalus. However, as we know, it's properly the residual nuclei of the Hispano-Visigothic power that managed to recover independence in the Asturias and in the Cantabrian mountains. These were very wild areas. I mean, historically, it's what also the Romans had struggled dramatically to curb. They had to send tens of legions. The same Augustus Agrippa had to go there to tame them. This had been a pain in the behind for the same Visigoths, because there were areas you couldn't really control firmly. So at a point, while the Muslims objectively receive an act of submission by all the peninsula, including the north, these are factually the communities that they cannot control, and that reorganized, in fact, resistance and a pushback from these areas. Except they were limited in power. I mean, it's always the same old story. There is the rich flatland, the lowland. We can't call saying flatland, if anything, because the Iberian Peninsula is like a large plateau at large, and the where the more developed areas are. The center of Spain is also kind of in between, telling you the truth. But the north is more mountainous. It's colder. It's an area that also culturally and ethnically didn't have too much to do with the rest. At least it was a heavily Celticized area in ancient times, and it had still, however, undergone important upheavals during the migration era, and so it had less, and mostly what these areas could carry out was guerrilla, right? So actually, guerrilla is a strong form of war, right? And it erodes on the long run. So yes, the Muslims could gather massive armies, periodically reassert their dominance locally. They even sacked Santiago de Compostela. They didn't profane the let's say the holy place, because the same Muslims had as the Christians later actually had a very open dialogue with the various communities that they had to control, right? When the Christians take over Toledo, there is properly an imperial idea of the Christian, in fact, Leonese Castilian king, that explicitly said that he was the ruler and protector of the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews. And the latter two communities were really big, right? They were massive. There's unlike any other part in Europe. And these communities were necessary. Again, we've seen it in the video about the Mudéjar militia that lasted also for a long time, right? Initially, they were given even further autonomies. They were very often also some of the most entrepreneurial sections of the population, right? And even when the struggle, let's say the frontier with the Muslim-held area was distanced by the Christian advance, still it took centuries before these people were diluted at some point, as you know, at the end of the Middle Ages, properly either forced to convert and or expelled from the country. So that's also another story. But they contributed dramatically for most of the Reconquista in the political balance, and the military one, of course, strategic one as well, right? Around 718, so here we are properly at the beginning, the Visigothic kingdom has just collapsed. The Asturian aristocracy elects a king, Pelagius, right? It is also kind of probably a mythical figure of the Reconquista, the beginning of the same, and so this struggle that wouldn't end, but almost 800 years later, right? While it's true that after Las Navas, to which today we don't arrive, the beginning of the 13th century, most of the Iberian Peninsula was under Christian control, and there was really nothing that the Muslims could do in practice. There were attempts, we've seen it. I've made videos about the Battle of Sagrayas, of Rio, not Sagrayas, but the Battle of Rio Salado and others. We'll have to talk about Sagrayas because it was a major Christian defeat, by the way. But let's say on the long run, the affirmation, especially of Castilla, Aragon, Navarre, Portugal, was there, right? It was not like it could have happened if the Muslims had scored victory after victory. It would have taken centuries. It would have been a completely different dynamic, and mostly North Africa, where at that point most of the Islamic power base was located, even to support the Emirate of Granada, the Nasrids, was less than the European one. This historically has always been the case. Like in Africa, in the westernmost part, northwesternmost part, yes, it has a hub of kind of regional power. The same is true for Tunisia, more or less, and Egypt, right? But overall, right, the northern shores of the Mediterranean have always been overwhelmingly richer and more populated than the southern ones, right? So even in terms of manpower, it was impossible to break through much on the long run. And so what the Muslims accomplished in the first centuries of their invasions was due to a heavy crisis, in fact, of the West in a way, but also, as we were just saying, actually riding the wave of actually local powers. Again, when we look at the Moors of Spain, those were Spanish people. I mean, the ones that had largely been before, right? Aside from this other mercenaries and other elements that came from North Africa, the majority of the populace was the one found in the previous centuries, and that adapted to the situation. This is true for many realities. I mean, but even this is not even a religious divide. I mean, many Saracens were Christian. This is notorious, right? Most of what we call the Saracens, the Moors, were Spanish, Italians, Greeks, right? At a point. So I also made several videos about the Saracens. And if anything, Al-Andalus instead represented, however, the major power, right, in the Western Mediterranean. Literally, right, if geographically speaking, in terms of compactness, for up to the 11th century, the 10th, the 11th century, you find objectively this was the main power, together with the Byzantine Empire from the other side, right? So, again, Christian Europe, Latin Germanic Europe was a much bigger system, right? And that was coalescing as such, and after this phase would instead overwhelm, would turn the tide. In Spain, it would take still time before, in fact, that the process would be accomplished, right? It's half of a millennium from the Islamic conquest and if anything, the Battle of Las Navas, right? Another almost 300 years before the last Muslim stronghold is conquered at Granada. So reflect on what this means even just locally, culturally, identitarily, right? It's a big, big deal. Under Alfonso I of the Asturias, who ruled between 739 and 757, Islam had already to abandon some of the northwesternmost territories in the Iberian Peninsula, namely the centers of Porto, Braga, Leon, Simancas, Osma, Salamanca, Avila, and Segovia. And thus the entire Galicia had been reconquered. So historically, again, this was an area that had already been quite autonomous, right? Also under Visigothic times, yes, at a point, the Suebi that had settled there had been crushed, but full control had never been really achieved, right? And if you look at the area, you also understand why. Because these areas were scarcely populated, and it came, and so it was not even particularly relevant from a strategical point of view. From a political point of view, more, because still it could represent a broader sack of resistance, but locally, and the Asturians mostly, had a chronic shortage of manpower, so it was impossible for them to firmly, stably occupy those territories, and instead lay south of the Cantabrian Mountains, that are an imposing bulwark by themselves geographically. Doesn't mean much, it's always politics that matter. But the richer lands were in the south, except because of the constant guerrilla that took place from the other side as well, because again, from the mountains, these Christian raiders arrived and looted and pillaged and all the worst thing you can imagine. So, as we have seen for other frontiers, and the Muslims did the same, of course, kind of became a no man's land, right? A frontier area, somewhat triggering some broader depopulation process, right? If you look at the I made a video about late medieval transhumance, for example, and we've seen that the largest producer of wool in late medieval times was Castile. Why? Because most of the areas that they had conquered had historically passed from even agriculturalism to pastoralism. Because at least, in some part of the year when war was less intense, the animals could come there to graze, but when war broke out, that they fled also because there was a lot of cattle raiding, etc. Agriculture on the long run was not a sensible business to invest, given that armies would come to pillage, to raise, etc. And so literally it was a massive economical transformation even of the same land. And that also characterized, the idea of the Castilian hidalgo, that was also a bit of a conservative, and at the end of the Reconquista, 1/3 of Castilian males were hidalgos, right? So it was kind of a gentry that had been born exactly in the previous centuries as a militarized one. So even the conquistadores or the victors of the Italian wars, etc., were mostly from this background, and even the custom that you find mostly in the imperial Catholic sides during even up to the 30 Years' War in Central Europe, this idea that the nobleman would fight in the pike square together with the other infantry, right? It was it is an hidalgo's a Reconquista legacy, because if 1/3 of the population is an hidalgo's, most of them would fight at that point, especially where warfare was becoming heavier by necessity on foot, right? Consider that the Spanish are the ones that properly start modern warfare with Gonzalo de Córdoba, the greatest commander in modern history, without any possible doubt. And that bringing, in fact, a lot of infantry warfare. Again, as always, the point was combined arms, etc. But at that point, it was also the massive Spanish wealth, thanks to the personal union of Castile and Aragon, and then the Americas, all the precious metals and so on, so that allowed things like the tercio to happen in the first place. So it's still embarrassing that we've made a lot of videos about modern warfare, but not much about the Spanish one, which is kind of ridiculous. So we have to compensate soon. But, I just pick my topics randomly and cyclically, so we just have to wait for luck to talk about that in any case. I won't leave you without food. But again, these cultural traits are very significant. And literally, this was a community made for war. Like, Christians and Muslims clashed in these no man's land in continuation. Right? It was like the habit, the normality. There are many areas, many frontier areas where this was true as well. I don't know, the Danube, the middle lower Danube, and was something like that. the same Muslims like in Anatolia did, or in Syria did something like that, etc. The local communities are molded by this clash. If we look geographically more eastwards, we see the Carolingian Intervention as well, which is a prelude to the Crusades, really, given the Roman and Christian meaning of Charlemagne's empire. And in spite of the defeat suffered in front of Zaragoza and the rout of Roncesvalles in 778, the Franks managed to organize a march, famously enough, south of the Pyrenees, the capital of which would become, quite meaningfully, Barcelona, that was conquered in 801. And this marked after the capture of Tarragona, the old Tarraco, in 808, had in fact the Ebro River as its frontier. Right, these were also historically importantly Romanized areas. We see Tarraco, the same Zaragoza is Caesarea Augusta, right? And this is a region that, as you know, with the Aragonese Catalonian power, would become properly something on its own, more projected towards the Mediterranean. In fact, there is a deal of Reconquest that takes form mostly along the coast, significantly with the help also of the Pisan and Genoese navies, whereas Castile has a much more markedly bulky and kind of feudal, continental, and landmass bias, also for which it would become the largest power in Spain during the Reconquista. And with a much greater, properly command bias, probably the king was provided historically with a much greater authority in the guise of an emperor. Right, the Visigoths had this kind of idea with the councils of Toledo. They wanted to imitate Constantinople. They sent nuts to Rome, and at this point, naturally, they had to. This is when they asked for help to the papacy to organize support together with the Franks, to send money, to send troops. So that's also where that mechanism, in fact, of Frankization, even in Iberian military style, increases, right? And also heavier cavalry is nurtured. I made videos about this. Again, there is Spanish warfare and Iberian warfare as well. These two distinct playlists. You can find plenty of stuff if you're interested in it. See the evolution of the Iberian knightly panoply. It's quite fascinating. And after a period of internal divisions that lasted up to the mid-9th century, so a division within the same Christian world, the Reconquista was resumed by Alfonso II of the Asturias, who ruled between 866 and 911. Quite meaningful dates. In Central Europe, you have at this point the end of the Carolingian dynasty, the rise of Henry the Fowler, etc. So even looking what is happening contemporarily is quite meaningful, because as we have seen also in that video about Vasconia, for our historical regions series, this is a moment of fragmentation, not just of the Carolingian Empire, but also of these other lands that in a way or another had partaken that broader magnitude, right? So there are interesting backs and forths. If there is a strong Christian empire, also the Reconquista sector is activated against the Muslims more easily, right? And so these internal struggles in the Asturias were normal because, the internal political dichotomy, dialectic was about, clashing against one another. We will see this because they distinguished the type of war they made against the Muslims as the one they made among themselves, but still. And at this point, there is a process of encapsulation, in fact, that is comparable to the rest of Europe, to a certain degree, not just because of the Muslims, right? The Vikings to harass the area. The Magyars arrive in Spain, as a matter of fact. So also Europe really suffered of the ways of the same peoples. And for this reason, the Spanish created some cities slash fortresses, such as Burgos. So to entrench and consolidate, restarting from there, and making an important effort locally with, accumulating all these resources for the fortification. The Kingdom of the Asturias also gave itself a less eccentric capital, that was Leon, at the beginning of the 10th century. So a place from which the political and strategic picture could be dominated more directly, but stepping in with kind of more direct involvement in the same polity. And in fact, new polities also appeared at this time. For example, around Burgos, Castilla, it was destined to become effectively such the main name in the Reconquista, became an independent county. We are around the mid-10th century. Here, Europe is starting again to re-expand gradually. At the beginning of the 11th century, Islamic Spain was undergoing at the same time a period of disintegration that is to be observed also in the broader Islamic world that is in crisis, like between the 10th, 11th century. This, in fact, these were statal models that the Muslims had inherited fundamentally from the Romans mostly from the Romans in the west, also the Persians in the east with the Abbasids, etc., to fragment, to collapse, right? The system is feudalized, and this happens also in the Byzantine Empire that had maintained, we were just making some videos about this the other day, about the Macedonians, the Macedonian dynasty, how this process of erosion of the middle class, right, of the medium landholders, let's say, that are gradually subjugated by the major properly feudal lords, private lords at this time, that large estate owners that start managing the system, but in a very private way. The Christians have an advantage here because they had already been fragmented, and so what happens through their feudalism at this point is actually they're expanding and consolidating on the bases that have already stabilized. Instead, Islam in this case is actually collapsing, right? The unity of the Cordoban Caliphate is shattered to the point the polity essentially disgregated into numerous emirates, the reyes, the taifas. They were culturally very brilliant, but incapable of opposing a united front to Christian pressure. And this to make it very simple, right? The Caliphate of Cordoba had never, as we've seen, fully controlled not just the Christian north, but even some of the frontier, say properly, the Islamic polities, right, in the northeast, that had also caused troubles, coups, internal strife, and so on. So no power at the time is like intact and properly unitary, right? So what happens here is rather, of course, there is a process of privatization and feudalization that brings these various kinglets to administer their own districts in a ever more autonomous, if not de facto independent way. And the caliphal power wanes, collapse, evaporates in the process. As we were saying before, there are different waves of, North African Berber tribes that reinject some warlikeness in consistent number, but at the same time they are fighting against local Muslims to take over, and they, even when they secure control, they are not so structurally secure like instead the Christian states. But again, it's a very long process, and the same Christian coalescence into properly feudal kingdoms is very slow. That's why also that kind of hybrid culture, because it was normal for, say, a local Christian count to have taifas allies, right, and vice versa, and fighting against one another. So it was a pretty messed up situation, telling the truth. Just say dominated in general by the clash between Christianity and Islam more broadly. In the same era, the Iberian Peninsula was exiting from its isolation in relation to the ensemble of Christendom. As we were saying before, both the Visigothic legacy and the fact that the Iberian Peninsula had de facto been taken almost completely over Islam had also isolated the same northern Christian powers of the land, because they were small powers, right? At this point, they start gaining more consistency, recovering some of the lost territory, at least the one that would probably actively conquer. There is not much of a truly Visigothic inheritance here, right? It's Christianity, the true identity, the true gluing factor. This is a very important paradigm shift in Iberian identity, right? Because you understand that the Reconquista has become truly the sole identity of these people, and of course in a Christian meaning, etc. But what I mean is that still these had been isolated powers. Like in the West, most of the in fact Western Europe had been encompassed by an empire. They were properly universal powers. Even lands like Britain that had not been yet invaded by the Franks, which would happen in 1066, was partaking, especially thanks to the deep connections with Rome, to this broader universal, in fact, Roman Catholic axis. The Iberian Peninsula draws lymph sap from that system, right, that supports importantly the Reconquista effort with, as we've seen, mercenaries, money, the same consolidation of an ecclesiastical hierarchy controlled by the papacy, and thus framing the newly reconquered territories within the broader West, right? And naturally, as we were saying at the beginning, there are peculiar characters of the region that remain, but still there is a solid interconnection also with the rest, with Frankish Europe broadly meant. Many pilgrims, for example, came to visit the tomb of the Apostle James in Compostela, and it's at that point, of course, that the first Frankish knights, or at least the consistent amounts of them that were willing to fight against the infidels, appear, right, in an atmosphere that was already one of crusade. And in fact, we witness with the same chansons de geste that talk about the Reconquista as well, and so the reactivation of struggle against the Moor. Part of historiography was molded. That's when the idea that Roncesvalles was, for example, an Islamic ambush, whereas they were mostly Basque. There were Muslim troops there, but that tells you how at the time also the local Christians were very often allied with the Muslims to avoid, in that case, the Carolingians to take over the land, because they were just foreigners kind of invading and conquering those places. But regarding the idea of crusade, or at least this broader the temper and the atmosphere that would have become the one of crusade, it's important to stress that Western knights had always been hired since a very long time in in the Reconquista effort, right? As early as the 8th century, surely there was some Frankish or Occitanian knight that would be hired by the northern Iberian, not just Christian, but sometimes also the Iberian Muslim powers as mercenaries, right? It's just a less dynamic moment in history, so we mostly document such an imposing Frankish participation to the Reconquista, starting from, in fact, what we consider the revival of the year 1000, when we can document things. But this actually shows, given the degree of organization of the same enterprises, how it was already habitual, really, to see mercenaries, pilgrims, because this had always traveled. Again, even though, of course, as we just documented, it was a viciously brutal and traumatically violent reality, still pretty much the entire world was like that. I mean, nobody ever stopped Christian pilgrims from going to the Holy Land throughout all the wars that were, the Islamic conquest and so on. So the same had been in Spain at the same time, except what we see here is probably a reactivation of the local powers as such. So the draw, more trade, in fact, more opportunities, pilgrimage, mercenarism, etc. At this point, the political and strategic initiative passes to the county of Castile, that had become a kingdom proper in 1035, and eventually united with the Leon. And the Reconquest changes face, in a sense, because at this point it takes on a bolder and more systematic character. The Tago River is reached, Toledo, and that's the main achievement, is taken in 1085. Conquering Toledo literally meant that the tides had turned at least to a point of broader style where, say, the Christians could control basically almost a half of the entire peninsula. And so they, in parallel, again, there were lots of other conquests, as we'll see now, and the development of further Christian polities in their Reconquista fort. But Toledo was a bit the capital of at least continental Spain in a broader sense. And so dominating it meant to have a lot of options regarding also just where you could continue the offensive, mostly towards the south. But not only. For example, in the west, consider that most of today's Portugal was had been under the Muslims. And Portugal is born at this point, as it became a county in 1071. It was mostly the northernmost part. I made a video about medieval Portugal last year. And it became a kingdom in 1143. And by the way, the Castilians thought it was kind of their own possession, a county on their own, so they would struggle for that. That's where the enmity also between various Christian powers that would slow down the same Reconquista began, even though it had always kind of existed. Then there is Aragon, that is also become a kingdom like Castile since 1035, same year, and that would be united a century later to Catalonia. So opening also to the Mediterranean, this entity would become properly the crown of Aragon that I made videos on. In the mid-12th century, a good half of the peninsula, so as we've seen, was under the Christian dominion. We're talking about a line here, longitudinally, uniting Lisboa, Toledo, and Tortosa, right across the entire peninsula. And this freed Spain was divided in 4 kingdoms, the canonic ones, like Portugal, Castile, and Leon, Navarre, and Aragon. and they all had their own different bias, right? Portugal had an important frontier character, as we've seen. It was also a very militarized reality. Castile and Leon was pioneering the political and strategic reconquest in the first place, and consolidating as the main feudal monarchy. Navarre was more distant, more French influenced. It at some point it did participate to the Reconquista. It kept sending troops to the mostly what were coalition armies, as most of the Middle Ages, but kind of remains entrenched in the north. Well, Aragon, as we've seen, has this broader kind of Mediterranean bias, and it's mostly concentrated in recovering the coastal cities, and Castilla tries to reach the Mediterranean as well, and there will be a struggle, as we've seen in the video, about the Kingdom of Valencia between the two powers. So again, it's a very slow but methodic and kind of hammering process. Consider that the clash against the Moors did not absorb all the warlike energies. As we were saying, there were at multiple steps internal conflicts, divisions, disagreements, right, of which direction to take, because again, every political military move meant still, even if it was directed against the Muslims in theory, that again were also many different powers, it meant actually favoring or disfavoring, in fact, the Reconquista plan of someone else of these Christian kingdoms. So it was always a big deal, and the Taifas played on it as well. So between the Moors and the Christians, there was never even a true general armistice, or it was not considered, also because politically it didn't make any sense. Right, there were so many different polities, there was always somebody who was at war against another, and the broader aim was the rule of Christianity or Islam, right? So, albeit there were truces, peaces, etc., throughout all the frontier line, there was always something going on, right? The truces and agreements were just partial, they were always precarious, and this speaks of the general instability of high medieval times in the first place. The process of reconquest also was not characterized by an irreversible, irresistible, continuous achievement. It was an alternate movement made of advances and withdrawals, and marked from both sides by bold incursions and also spectacular defeats, for that matter. In fact, up to the early 13th century, when also, the huge alliance that won Las Navas after recent, in fact, defeat against the Muslims, that also entailed a great international coordination with the papacy, with other powers, etc. The tides could be turned again, right? The Muslims did have still some important cards to play, and there were different waves and different threats posed by the revival of Islamic offensive, right? So just even think at, again, how this informs the local communities, because they are obliged at that point to take side, right, and to make their part, and they can't just say, oh, well, doesn't matter. Like today, people hear about war and say, well, I don't mind. It involves every single one, right? Who doesn't act is done for, right? It was very clear to people living 1,000 years ago. Today, it seems just we have entirely forgotten that. It's not a good civilizational indicator. But as we know, on the long run, Islam lost. And this doesn't mean, of course, that the military system of the Cordoban Caliphate, or even the one of the later taifas, was devoid of valor or coherence, right? This is always a mistake to avoid, right? Determinism, teleologism. As a matter of fact, the Muslim and Christian military systems were pretty much similar, if not the same. I mean, if you pick an Iberian fighter, and there is literally no, most of the times, to attribute a Christian or Islamic character to it. And as we've just said, also because Christians fought for Islam as much as Muslims fought for Christendom in the same context very often. So that, again, was not the discriminant. Also, we're talking about high medieval times. I mean, material culture is pretty much the same, especially in a regional scenario. It doesn't matter how the Iberian Peninsula is big, because that's also a thing. And of course, there is a diversification. I mean, the northeastern part is much more French-looking, and the southern part is much more kind of North African-looking. But also, again, because there were literally people from those places there in very consistent numbers. However, we can outline some sort of, characteristics of the two systems that do not have to be taken for radically categorical differences, let's say. And by the way, I will make a video, of multiple videos actually, about the army organizations of all these various powers in detail in the various different eras. So at least 7 or 8 for this entire time, if we're not talking about tactics, the unit types, etc. So the plan is to cover everything, and we already started that, as you know. So next to the Christian frontier from the Islamic side, there were some military territories, the so-called Tugur, that varied from the average provincial districts of the Muslim hinterland. In the 10th century, a mark around Zaragoza watched the Pyrenees surveilling and blocking Aragon and Navarre. Another one towards the west around Medina Celi was opposed to the Kingdom of Leon and of Castile. The Muslim army was composed by permanent corps. They didn't count many elements. Numerically, we're talking about some retinues pretty similar to the ones of the continental European masnate, let's say. Mostly heavy cavalrymen, right? And probably more, kind of properly heavier than the Islamic average could find numerically in, I don't know, even in Egypt or the Near East, right? Because of the greater similarity of Spain, after all, also in the Muslim eras, to the rest of Europe. The principal unit was the Palatine Guard of the Emir, or the Caliph, that was quartered in Cordoba and was recruited mostly among slaves of foreign origin. Mostly North Africans, but also Christians. The important was just for these men to depend on the sovereign, so that even if they were heathens, actually they could provide the advantage of not mixing too much in the local political, hence religious, disputes and siding with this or that factor. They would do it anyway, because at the end of the day they didn't care, and they did it for salary. But these were very fine troops. They had the highest training quality, and they really followed the sovereign, the major military campaigns. Then there was kind of the bulk, properly, of the army, numerically made up by those warriors serving in virtue of their ictas. So these were some kind of quasi-feudal troops dicta was, like you say, the Byzantine pronoia, right? In the Islamic world, it was just a land plot, some multiple ones, depending on just like the mansi in the Frankish world, in exchange for which military service had to be rendered, except while in continental Europe mostly these mansi were lost, and the service became kind of hereditary just in those years. Powers like the Muslim ones, sort of had a higher degree of centralization, mostly could take back the control of the dictas, ideally, right? And that's why, in fact, the same system feudalizes similarly, because at some point, when the state collapses, there is a very few control on who could take over the system. In fact, the taifas are de facto kind of feudal lordships, right? Then there were naturally mercenaries recruited out of Spain. So again, in that scenario, mostly North Africans, but also troops coming sometimes from the Middle East, etc. And again, we find the traces of this in equipment. Some were very fine troops, and they were very different kinds, right? And you can hardly distinguish this from actually the guard units, if not from the hierarchy, from the type of organization that we'll have to get into details of at some point. But as you can imagine, there were units who rose to higher honors, others were disbanded. The permanency also was some kind of regimental continuity dictated by various political, military, and social contingencies. Then there were the Andalusian Militias of the local population, that were autonomously organized. And on average, of course, they were less valuable, but they provided with an important amount of troops numerically, and these were quite important for sieges, for blockading all these various fortresses around which medieval warfare also during the Reconquista revolved. And again, the Iberian ground is terrifying, right? It's nightmarish to say the least. Right? There's an important thermic excursion during the day and night. There's this endless plateaus dotted with this had originally Celtiberian oppida and in various sometimes even arid areas. So it's terrifying to fight in there. Very few places to hide. Cavalry and this hit and run tactics were all around, guerrilla, again, just like in ancient times. And so everything was very attritional, as you understand it. Militias did their part, if anything, as sort of military colonies at some point, because the local communities, as we've seen, also the Mudayar that are integrated in the Christian armies are the militias of the local towns, right? That they have mostly also to defend themselves against these raiders, and that in fact have very few to do most of the times with the Holy War. They were just a bunch of brigands and martyrs. In fact, the same volunteers of the Holy War, were very segmented. Some, of course, were generally, and the thing was much more widespread in mentality than we think, to fulfill at least once in their life the religious duty of the jihad. But, this was a kind of universal ambition of everyone, as we've explained. Religiously speaking, the same jihad comes from the same Indo-European Holy War the Arabs had gotten from the Persians, and the Christians had their own Holy War, and that's kind of, again, glorious military lordship of Christ and of Christ God. So it was like pretty much the same for everyone, but it's obvious that the loot played an enormous part, especially because these volunteers for the Holy War, as we've seen also, and this is true also for, some pilgrims during crusades. Think about the Rhineland massacres. I mean, there was the scum of the earth within them. Think about even in the Middle East, the frontier areas historically were the fringe ones, like in Mesopotamia and other. You had the orthodoxy, you had the state, you had the power, in the fringe areas, there were a bunch of wild people that spent their entire life raiding and killing and and slaughtering. So it was just that, right? And so the most fanatic ideas, and that were also all one with the most diseased lifestyle, telling the truth. And of course, the greatest power is the one that has the greater rationale. But these forces are needed because, again, they are the chthonic elements of the masses that crawl all around, that pave the way to the advance of the larger armies, and so of the light. And this is true both for Christians and Muslims and any other power at the time. And it's obvious that aside from loot, the maintenance of the army required some considerable sums. In particular, in the regularly, let's say, registered effectives in the roles of the Divan perceived a pay, right? The Divan was the kind of financiary office where, bureaucratically controlled the pay of the troops. Very political thing as well. But again, tax, resources, etc. had to be invested in the army most of the time. It was the greatest expense of any power at that point. And except in the periods of truce, military expeditions took place every year. As you understand, starting from the 8th century, there is a big deal still of seasonalism in warfare. Towards the 12th instead, we have a full professionalization, and so warfare happens on a much larger scale with much greater intensity. Normally, from the Muslim side, the preparations began in June. And I don't know exactly why, because normally in Southern Europe, war began earlier, in March, normally, right? It was the same for the Romans, for the Italian communes at this time. Instead, as you know, in north of the Alps, like Charlemagne, it's the field of May, normally. You can understand that because it's colder, so you need specific resources, the fodder for the horses, etc. But in the south, in Al-Andalus, why June? Well, it may be because they called troops from very far away, including maybe North Africa. And it took a big deal of time to prepare in this sense, like by gathering lots of troops on a very large scale, and this kind of more, in fact, properly gathering composite nature that is a bit typical of Muslim armies. If you look even at crusading warfare, that we made lots of videos on describing the armies. Sometimes, I don't know, think about the Seljuks that called, like, they didn't even need to call troops. Everybody knew when expeditions were mounted up, so news traveled fast, and even people from Central Asia gathered there just to loot, right? So you knew that if the big army was moving, especially the elite, that required also massive logistical capacities because of the horses, the general heaviness, etc. There were lots of people who just joined, right? Think about the saddler trains, merchants. They would be subcontracted, the same logistics, etc. This is true also from the Christian side, but the Christian side, as we've seen, was more contained. It was, let's say, the politics were more in detail territorially, and they just didn't have the same space. Let's say they could call troops from far away, from France, from other countries, but at the same time they were probably more used to rely on the local communities. So at least the caliphal armies in the early days were probably taking more time together. This is the only reason why I can't think like that. And in July, the caliphal army, in which, by the way, the horsemen were much more numerous than the infantry, or at least they constituted a very remarkable part because of that kind of predatory nature, because of, I don't know, lots of Bedouins that knew just how to fight a horse. They would arrive like light cavalry most of the times, not heavy. The Christians had less cavalry, but it was heavy. This is kind of typical, right? We do not have to extremize it that much, of course, but on average, it is true. Of course, there is also different things that you can do with such kind of army composition also strategically. And this mass of men gathered at the presence of the Caliph in a based encampment north of Cordoba. He was deputed to, just again, the field of Mars march. And the insignia of command were distributed in the Great Mosque, right? And here put back at the end of the campaign. So just like from the Christian side, there was the blessing on the sword on the altars, and the cross, of course, brought in battle. That was the main standard, and the aim was strategically the one, surely seizing fortresses to raid, pretty much. Prisoners were deported, peasants, women destined to harems, young men destined to satisfy the homosexual appetites of the Moorish chieftains. Slavery was all over the place, by the way, and just the Christian society had a little bit less at that point, but still, they used the Muslims in very similar ways. The repartition of the loot, once the state had seized its part, was reserved to it, first of all, was made in relation to the military and social condition of the warriors. So, of course, those who had deserved more, but also were more powerful, the same lords who had put together their district army, were the ones that eventually would have, coming home, distributed loot as well, etc. To these composite forces were sustained by a well-organized state that didn't lack nor men nor financial resources for those time standards. You may wonder what the rough and archaic Christian kingdoms of the north could oppose. In the kingdom of the Asturias in the 8th century, the institutional break with Visigothic times is remarkable. When you look even at the names of the military organization, you see there's been an important change. The sources in Visigothic times spoke of duces, comites, prepositi exercitus, the Tiufadi, the Gardinghi, right? So this is a mix of Roman and Germanic titles, names, like duces. They were a bit more Germanically biased because the comites were kind of similar to what at least the more Romanized areas kept maintaining as names. In fact, in Spain, there was this difference. The south was very Romanized, the Ebro Valley towards the sea too, whereas in the Iberian Plateau, the idea of the duke, right, so the military commander was stronger, because the Visigothic military colonies that had been founded at the time of the occupation. The Tiufadi, the Gardinghi, were kind of upper troops, like of clients of the king. And there was an important, pre-Islamic times, the Visigoths had been developing some sort of feudal system, not as intense as the Carolingian one, but still within the pattern of it, because most of the latifundia in Spain had been maintained, right, in spite of the general contraction of the early Middle Ages, etc. So there were this large retinues of troops, etc. But the kingdom was very disorderly and agitated when the Muslims invaded, and that's why it was taken over so quickly in the first place. But we know, of course, that by that time, talking about the beginning of the 8th century, the annona system had disappeared. So the traditional Romano-Germanic levy system, especially this Iberian reality, had really disappeared. Because the state did not exist as such anymore, as a unitary power, really, or at least one that could control fully how the local retinues were starting to, were already sustaining themselves. Like, so we will talk about I made a video about the Visigothic Army as well, so if you're interested, you can look at that. But just to make another example, there is no such thing like the Publicae Expeditiones, that is to say, properly the saddle campaigns. But of the so-called fonsado or fossato, which is a term of popular origin, of which some etymologies have been proposed. The first one would be fossa, that is trench. So a tactical procedure that was actually used in the war against the Muslims, both, for example, in 816 and 825. It could stem from the verb fossare. These are all Latin, Romance etymologies. That is to transfix, to transpass the enemy. Right. So some kind of offensive capacity, like assault troops, right? Attacks, raids, etc. Or the word fosso, that is in the meaning of border frontier, right? However, it's clear that the so-called fossato corresponds to a great expedition. In fact, to an offensive campaign led by the king or by a powerful magnate, and so that probably entails, still in that political social context of these various early, in fact, powers. First of all, yes, an offensive attack against properly an external enemy, somebody that is conceived like out of the politics and not necessarily like a civil strife internally, but properly the expedition was habitually launched against the neighbors, Muslim or Christian alike, by a certain degree. But we will see there is a distinction eventually that is made even between the two. Fossatoria or fonsadera indicated the indemnity paid when somebody essentially wouldn't perform the military service of the fossato, which was juridically a duty, by the way, because this essentially the Romano-Germanic levy and the idea that all free, able-bodied men should perform military service in a community molded by war, and when war was so habitual, was a big deal. Was actually a duty and a privilege at the same time. As we have seen in that video about the 11th century Spanish infantrymen, we notice that the Iberian Peninsula is slightly, even the Christian side is slightly less feudal than other lands. That is to say, there is less social stratification, as you can imagine, in these more primitive communities of the north. And so this means that there is kind of less of a feudal elite that does everything while others work for it. And let's say the average person is more involved in warfare, like it was, let's say, in early medieval times, as opposed to the later high medieval ones, with feudalism kind of consolidated further. And this is, in fact, the future also of Iberian warfare in the following centuries. In any case, it's the monarch's task to mobilize the army, and his role of leader is naturally essential. So the danger is incumbent most of the times. As we've seen, all the able-bodied freemen have to serve in the army. And before the campaign, the king, that naturally has its own, say, personal retinue of milites, reunites the other various lords in his palace, right? So at this time, again, especially in these realities, the monarch is just more like a primus inter pares and is struggling to affirm also politically and institutionally the monarchy and his suzerainty on the other lords, right? So they all look pretty much alike. They are lords that live in castles and have their retinues, etc. Also the Muslims are like that, especially on the frontier with the Christians. And so there is a sort of gathering that in the yearly military expedition that could happen or so more frequently depending on the nature of the operations and so on, would be also a political test of who was to participate, right? Some wouldn't because they disagreed with the ruler and or because they were too poor. So this would prove essentially who counted among this force. And every comes, so every count, assisted by functionaries known as majordomini or majorini, brought with him and leads his own contingent, of course. So there was some proto-bureaucratic development, say, for checking which communities had to participate or not. This majordomini were deputed to kind of smoothen the process, to fluidify it. They received compensation for it, etc. For a long time, infantry was important because a mass of peasants, of small landowners that could be either free or kind of servants. For example, the emphithausis was an important system of dependency. You know, it was just saying to a family, if you were a lord, you had lots of land, you told to a family, okay, well, you can install yourself on this land, and like for 99 years, let's say it's yours. At least you can use it, but it remains mine. So in 99 years, my descendants, whoever owns the land, has the right of claiming it back. And so it was a way to tie people to and properly familiar nuclei as manpower, labor force to the land, which meant that, of course, at the moment of the contract, nobody cared because nobody was to live 99 years of the contractors. But after those generations, of course, the Lord could come back and say, what about now? And of course, the general trend was to the increase of lordly power, and so the gradual subjugation of these masses. And so that's a moment where feudalism spreads. And in fact, in warfare, also the heavier elite cavalry, right, also among these communities. But as we were saying, the infantry was grouped in various communities. They had to take part mostly in a defensive clash, where also the foot troops are more effective. Telling the truth, the protection of the so-called civitates, of the castra and of the ville, that are Latin terms to say that the civitas is probably the city, the ancient Roman city, very often district. The castrum is the fort, you could say the castellum too, the castle. And the ville are more like rural villages, right? Rural communes, things like that. And there was an intense cooperation of these communities before monarchies developed further their capacity of controlling them and exacting forces and so on. And it's obvious that the infantry would have this greater role, especially in a defensive strategic context. But when the Muslims began to give way, the in devastating incursions, the rapid raids, in fact, became also from the Christian side one of the most fundamental types of operation. Of course, cavalry had always been there. Again, if you think about the Cantabrian tactics, and this had always been part of those pretty rough mountainous areas. So the concept that, I don't know, in the mountains there is more infantry and let's say tendentially yes, but not operation, like true from a political and social point of view, because still the people who live there, generally speaking, as we've seen, are on the defensive, right? But it's obvious that if they had to fight even in the same valleys or whatever, they had their own cavalry. What I mean is that the cavalry operations would be ever better organized, and so the local communities ever more functionalized for a cavalry development. And as you know, the cavalryman armament is very costly. Most cavalry is light, right? And we will see it now. But the heavy cavalryman, already in Visigothic time, was something like, say, we picked the 10th century, so kind of a midway in today's timeline. Like a horse costed something between 4 and 10 oxen, and 40 and 100 sheep, and 40 and 100 modi of wheat. A cot of mail equated to 60 sheep in cost. So an enormous one. As you understand, the horse costs more because you have to upkeep it. And horses eat and drink an astonishing amount of stuff, for which they also heavily condition the type of operation, and they are very resilient but delicate animals, so that if you get crippled or something, especially in this warfare, it was about much javelin throwing, it was a problem. But of course the strategic needs dictated this development, and the benefits surpassed the costs. So the sovereign can ask for a similar heavy panoply or of such service to those to whom he has normally granted a fief that was known as prestamo or prestimonium, which from the etymology suggests that, again, the kind of pre-feudal mentality that the land was just lent and not lost, actually, by the kings when giving it to someone, so they could, in theory, take that back. As we've seen, it's a bit like the Ikta, right, from the Muslim side. Gradually, they would both feudalize and kind of take root dynastically on the owner's power. Also, the Iberian Peninsula has cities, right, important ones of Roman foundation, and they're very significant strategically, as we've seen. The same Toledo was central in the Iberian Plateau strategy, which means that there were some middle classes who could afford military service, also not just from much of a feudal rural lifestyle, but also out of personal income, say in the cities, for which reason the military duty towards the population as a whole tend to diminish, meaning that, say, if in the wilder, more primitive areas, more or less, there are less resources, so people have to make a greater effort collectively. If I seize a city and I start having more money, I can simply cash more from there and squeeze less the individuals that I will also get, that objectively will prefer by a certain extent to just be peasants and not fighters, right? Voluntarily, even in the face of the risks they had to confront with it during the service, etc. So again, we're talking about centuries of history, so the thing is very variegated, but the tendency is also, yes, the Christians, of course, as they have this greater impetus because they are the ones who are risking the most, but then when they conquer the lowlands and they become more powerful, they also relax a little bit. A bit like the Muslims had relaxed to the point that their state had collapsed, except, as we've seen, the Latin Germanic formula were at this point kind of more solidly based and heading towards further development, thanks to feudalism, in fact. And that's why infantry loses ground in favor of a cavalry often provided by the cities, right? And also by the great and rich people known as the nobiliores, proceres, locupletes, rici homines, that have received by the king the honores in full property, and they are surrounded by their retinues, military armed retinues, the fideles, the satellites, the vassalli, the homines. And this vocabulary is much, in fact, more similar to the Frankish one, right? In the Latin terms that were used at the time in the documents, suggesting not just much of properly, even in an influence from the Frankish world, but also the affirmation of more properly feudal society that is described like this. Many of these horsemen, these knights at a point, are noblemen, but they're also tendentially lighter than what you would see in the rest of Western Europe. This is a specific Iberian warfare trait. They mount, so they called a la jinete, right? They use short stirrups, a very low saddle, very particularly shaped bite for the horse, differently from the knights of the rest of Europe, that instead sit on very enveloping saddles, and they enjoy also a very much more solid system. Let's say, because they were heavier, right? So it costed more, and they were consequently also less. They were more of an elite. In the Iberian Peninsula, this thing like the leveling of properly the knightly panoply to the full Western standards will arrive towards the 13th century, right? But still, then you find in Iberian warfare lots of mounted javeliners, like you don't see in most of post-Carolingian Europe, right? This is very important to stress, and this is due, as we've seen, to the general mobilization of the community. So there were more people that fought also in a more popular sense, right? And so also the specific raiding nature of Iberian warfare brings to that kind of light cavalry to be more widespread. Again, you can't really distinguish, if you look at the jinete, whether he is Muslim or Christian just by the fighting style. They fight in the same identical way, also with the same panoply, because let's say the metal armor is structured by the specifics of war, because it speaks of the elites, and so of something that at a higher level looks different, let's say. But the average people, they felt pretty much the same way. The jinete were very lightly, if not sometimes even properly not armored. And this horseman used the so-called Torna-Fuye tactics, which literally means kind of come back and escape, run tactics, so hit and run tactics. That is the same one used by the Muslims with the name of Karr-va-farr, which is literally the same. And of course, their role is to open the hostilities, skirmishing, giving time to heavy cavalry to deploy, and also operating on the same battle line, mostly on the flanks, right, to harass the enemy side, etc. And there are lots of, there is a lot of horsemanship there. I made a video about even these mounts, specifically in the Reconquista's times, and there is, generally speaking, the stereotype that the Arabs had kind of the best mounts for that kind of warfare, and that they were more mobile, and that instead the Christians were heavier. Also, probably the Near Eastern Crusaders and also the ones of the Reconquista. Instead, sources do not suggest that at all. Right? We have even properly heavy cavalry chasing the lighter one in some instances, and the horse breeds were really something. Right? There is all an equine military history that is very much underrated, but in terms of the level of equestrian culture, right, it was pioneered in these contexts by men that were, as we've seen, cattle. These were herdsmen fundamentally. They lived with the animals. They fought over the animals. They lived over the animals by a certain degree. So they doesn't matter how light kind of their warfare was, but they knew how to perform some tacticals collectively that probably, especially in early times, we don't know much about, telling the truth, but that probably were very advanced. in some way. Just, they were lighter troops, so they were also less important as a consequence. That's why eventually the heavier model takes over, right? But this is a land where that kind of equestrian culture is very developed in this Torna-Fuye Karr-va-farr style, fighting style. Towards the mid-11th century, in Leon and Castile, the constitutive elements of the army can be listed as the following. Consider Leon and Castile here are the most militarily developed centers from the Christian side, right? So they also have a greater political and military unit, so they have the best organization, and they kind of lead the Reconquista. So from one side we have the infanzones, or caballeros hidalgos, that participate to the forzado in virtue of their fief holding or because they receive money for it. So infanzones, caballeros hidalgos means essentially the nobility, the full nobility, or at least for how it was being defined feudally at that time. Then there are the caballeros villanos, that is to say the urban or popular cavalry in a sense, and they are particularly numerous in the Duero Valley. They are a sort of, in fact, commoners' cavalry, the importance of which increases, by the way, after during the 80s of the 11th century. They come, in fact, both from the city and the countryside, so much that it's been possible to compare them in some way to the non-noble citizens of the Italian communes that were owing military service on horseback in virtue of their economic status. And trying to distinguish them from the feudal nobility on the battlefield is pointless, because they fundamentally were a bit like the same people. They had the same kind of equipment, the same degree of training, also because, and more in Spain, perhaps even though, as we've seen, feudal cavalry was not as developed also as in the western parts like Italy, they had kind of the same lifestyle, also the rural nobility, right? And just recently I made a video about the Italian consulate and therefore the city Milites, showing how the same Italian communes had been founded by the actual knights and ruled by that establishment for the first century of communal history, and even after that the same people could provide with its own heavy and very so cavalry as well. So Spain has actually a lesser degree of urbanization towards Italy, that is the highest, but still it's similar, right, in concept to the kind of military service rendered in this context. Then, in fact, there were the contingents of pedones that were provided especially by the cities in virtue and in function of their fueros. That is to say, these were the communities we were saying before who had spent also consistent amount of their energies just to defend themselves, because they just were also helped by the defensive infrastructure, the various walls, and the general prosperity of the cities as markets, etc., and so could provide with an important infantry. Then, in fact, in Spain has, for the aforementioned reason, so a bit less of a feudal nature, a bit more of a urban nature than the Western average, this important men, in fact, large amounts of infantry. And many of these infantrymen were the so-called mudéjar as well. Mudéjar could be also cavalrymen, but we're talking about Jewish and Islamic militias that made up, in certain areas of Spain, like in the Kingdom of Valencia, up to 40% of the entire population. So you couldn't make war without them in the first place. And probably they brought, especially the Muslim communities, some kind of specific exotic influence, like some, or at least there is this idea that archery, as opposed to properly the bows as opposed to crossbows, were more of a Muslim thing, like the Saracens of Luther in the army of Frederick II, like in a time where all the locals would use crossbow, and there would be bows, but still in less number, and the crossbow was the future in a sense, like because of their Arabic bias would use kind of more this kind of lighter, also skirmishing infantry, etc. That, in fact, yes, in the Islamic armies probably was more numerous than in the Christian one, where infantry was generally speaking heavier, right, tendentially at least, for the same reasons we were talking about before, kind of greater per capita wealth, given that the Al-Andalus was ruled by these great landowners, right, and there was a rich middle class as well, but let's say it was more just like a big estate. So before those estates would be taken over by the Christians, generally speaking, and as we've seen, there was a bit less of let's say, even of a heavy cavalry paradox. There is, in fact, an interesting point about this. There is considering the amount of heavy cavalry that the same Muslims could field. Probably at the time of the Caliphate, especially, the Muslims had very important numbers of heavy cavalry, right? And that is not even just an advantage in different ways. You see, here we should make a comparison between the different type of communities and how they worked, right? But also for launching raids in this wider north, etc., just two heavy forces are unnecessary. It's important to have skirmishers, etc. Plus, if you have mostly troops that you hire from other countries where light cavalry is a bit the norm, you will tendentially have that phase. The reason why the Christians are heavier is because they also are pushing towards the more fortified south, the more kind of open plain south, and they are influenced by the West, where, you know, the feudal concentration of wealth in the hands of few really provides a lot of heavy cavalry, right? Maybe not so many, but qualitatively very high. So there is a bit of a hybrid there in Spain that, as I was saying before, sometimes makes you say, but, you know, can we even trace a difference so distinctly or stereotypically between the various sides? Well, consider, again, we're talking about 400 years of history, so there were some important shifts in the process, which literally meant the same communities were fighting at a point, first under the Muslims and then under the Christians, but they were the same people. So you can't say the same ones, specifically the same communities. So changes occur, but also allegiances shift, right? Consider there are lots of Western knights at a point that come to fight in, not just in as crusaders, but literally, we've seen it especially in Portugal sometimes, crusaders were passing by the Atlantic coast, etc. They just entered this place. They settled, you know, by dislodging Muslim from somewhere. It's not that they took previous agreements with the local Christian kings. It's at a point the kings that say, that knock at their door, say, oh look, you know, we have advanced up to here, you're Christian, so do you want to be my vassal, and I will instate you here and you fight for me? Yeah, okay. And so many people coming from France, England, etc. would become, I don't know, Portuguese or Spanish nobility in the process as well. So when we look altogether, also the Christian service duties, we realize that they changed on the base of the war, the kind of war was being fought. For example, the word guerra, deriving from the Germanic verra, indicated by preference the, let's say, internal clash between magnates, in opposition to the bellum that is directed against the Muslims. And within the etymologies of verra and bellum, there are very different cultural visions, because verra comes from the Germanic, and it is more about kind of hit and run tactics. It's a concept that developed, you know, among the tribesmen, right? The Latin Bellum is instead the major clash, right? It's the big expedition, right? So in Spain, these terms had come to identify like the internal kind of harassment questions, disputes within the various magnates, like the mob, like hit and run clashes and harassment and so on. Whereas the Bedlam, at least in theory, should differ. It was pretty similar to that as well against the Muslims, because it was the big expedition where, at least in theory, the armies were larger, because normally the entire Christian community locally participated to it. So that's the kind of idea behind it. The Hueste instead corresponded to the great offensive led by the king or his lieutenant. The Fonzado to restricted campaigns launched especially against cities, interestingly enough. And this could connect with the idea of trench frontier, because it was just going, like if you attack a city normally, a big royal expedition was normally heading towards a city, but it was also the idea of kind of you will meet some broader enemy force. So the concept of pitched battle probably was more out there, was something more grandiose, right? Of course, cities wouldn't just sit there, suffering the siege. Somebody would count their relief. So also during the Fonzado, this would happen. But the idea that normally this step-by-step siege warfare during the Reconquista is endless process, right? As we've seen it in the video about the Kingdom of Valencia, this took entire centuries for conquering, tens, hundreds of kilometers of frontier. So it was just, again, the next city, right? Also physically, geographically, like the closest one. So the Fonzado assumed, like, what's next compared to our frontier, whereas the Bellum sometimes could go far beyond, because naturally also some centers would, when such large forces would be gathered, would simply surrender and or could come back in the hands of the enemy quite quickly, also because internally factions were always struggling one against the other for that. The appellido instead was some kind of the call of arms, right? It was the general mobilization in case of invasion. There was finally the incursion in enemy territory, indicated by words such as cavalgata, so the cavalry raid, right? The cavalcade, literally, chevauchée. The algara, the corredura, which means still about running, right? Raiding. And azzaria. A chronicle of the 12th century meaningfully describes such type of war. It says, quote, "Every day, great cavalry squadrons came out of the castles. These squadrons, in our language, are called algarades. And they went left and right, sacking all the land of Seville, of Cordoba, and of Carmona, and they laid waste with fire all of this country." And this is interesting because Seville and Cordoba were the centers of Islamic power, so, and very distant at that time from the major frontier, even though this was very deep, and the same expeditions proved it. And they show how, say also, if the land was so strategically permeable, it was also because it was politically divided. So obviously there was specific, preparation, also kind of political testing of what the local communities could react like in case of attack, right? Consider that algarade has its etymology in dispute, quarrel, insult, right? It's the algarade, it says the disturbance, right? Some of these words also have Islamic, Arab, etymology. So that's quite interesting as well. But yeah, this is pretty much it to give an idea also what kind of the, if anything, more like the mindset of the two sides really was more about. Naturally, we're better documented about the Christian side because, like, the Islamic societies had a different relation with writing. I mean, they made even a greater amount of they produce a greater amount of written documents, let's say, especially in the earlier times. But let's say also the relation with history, with certain vision of the world, was really different from the West. So we get less information, and much also was destroyed, presumably, during the Reconquista. So it's more difficult to document. But as you understand, the main thing here being, again, not much the organizational or operational differences, or rather, again, the way they would see it like, because in practice they looked quite similar, literally on the same battlefield, and how they fought and how equipped they were, etc. And that's why we have to come back on it. We haven't properly even began to describe accurately this context. But again, a step at a time, just like a castle at a time during the Reconquista. We hope to cover everything in decent depth at a point. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.